Hi guys, so in yesterday's video I was explaining to you that it can be very useful to think in terms of the units of meaning as being of three kinds. The sign, which is the unit of everyday language. We have signs in words. They are the most obvious signs that we use, okay? We have symbols that are more like at the opposite end of the spectrum, the collective archetypes, concrete things, not abstract things, that condense into themselves like, hundreds of generations, years, millennia of experiences, and that are active in the psyche. That's part of the collective unconscious. And if you like, at the getting closer to the membrane between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious, you have this area which we could call the personal unconscious, insofar as it's getting closer to the area of the collective. That really is populated with ciphers, units of meaning that are not quite signs, that are transmuted signs on the way to becoming symbols, but never quite becoming symbols, okay? That's the language of the deepest unconscious, insofar as it's not the collective unconscious, okay? In the collective unconscious, there's no ciphers, there's no signs, there's symbols, primordial images, archetypes. There's also a symbol that has the particular quality of articulating the connection, the stitching between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. This stitching, right, this metaphor of the stitching is very important. In a way, it's a cipher, by the way. That's why I have to use a metaphor in order to refer to it. Otherwise, you wouldn't get what I mean. Like, in the life of the young child, there is no real separation between conscious and unconscious until a little bit later on, right? And the way in which the child enters consciousness and into the separation between consciousness and the unconscious is in many ways through the experience of a loss, the loss of the fusion with the mother or with the mother figure. Now, this experience of loss also introduces the mother not just as fused with the ego, but as an object in the ego's life. And that particular object relation ends up constituting the prototype of all forms of relations in the future. And so you end up being an ego with a rich world of external objects and also of internal objects that are introjections of your particular experiences, thoughts linked by affect, connected by affect in your particular self. The self as understood as the ego with its objects, the ego as a bigger, the self is bigger than the ego, right? You always have to remember that. The ego in relation to its objects as having representations linked with affects for each of these internal representations of relationships. A few more things besides the ego ideal and everything and other things. That's your self. The self also includes your unconscious, but the unconscious, since it emerges as fully just not consciousness with this separation from the loved object, that it becomes understood and apprehended as an object through the separation. The birth of the unconscious and consciousness is always at the same time a scar, a wound, a cut, right? And paradoxically, this cut, which we are as NI dominants are always trying to heal, to patch, to mend, to repair, and that is the core narrative of our fundamental fantasy of repair. That cut is also a stitch, right? Now that might not make a lot of sense, but that's really, if you like, a wound or a scar and a stitch. Obviously, there is a connection between these two words. You can't understand the word stitch if you don't understand what wound means, for example, or cut means. The unconscious is famously full of polysemy. It's partly because the deeper we get, we are in the realm of ciphers. And it makes sense there, from the point of view of the unconscious, to think of that particular cut as also a stitch. And this stitch is the connective tissue, the link that remains between our unconscious and our consciousness. People who have a void instead of this stitch, have an emptiness instead of this wound, because the wound is an embodied thing. It has concreteness. It might be open, might be bleeding, but it's still concrete. If there is a kind of empty like empty space there, or a void. Now, we're talking about a denial of separation, a persistence of the belief in fusion, not adapted to the reality of in fact, the principle of reality, the fact that we are in a world with its own rules and norms, and this about relating to others. In a sense, we are in the world of psychosis. So it's very important to have this stitching between the unconscious and between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, and through that, a stitching between the unconscious and consciousness, okay? This stitching, which is a scar, which is a wound, is precisely that specific symbol, which in the case of an I-dominance, gives meaning and is the engine of the desire of the fantasy of repair. For other types, my hypothesis, as you know by now, is that there's not a fantasy of repair at the core of the web of the narratives that guide the person unconsciously throughout life and give meaning. There is another fantasy that dominates, and that fantasy is the core projection of another symbol, which has in common with the ani symbol that it also constitutes like a connective tissue between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The shadow is full of ciphers. The shadow is that part of the personal unconscious that goes quite deep, and the deeper we get, the more we're in the domain of ciphers, which also helps you understand why to talk of the 8th slot function as something that makes sense in our life. So for example, my SI. In fact, SI is written in ciphers in my unconscious because it's so deep down. So it doesn't really make sense to talk about it as something that in fact is meaningful alongside NI, FET, I, and SE, right? Perhaps we can make a point that NE is still written in words, or at least in signs that have the same form as words, but not the deeper functions that are deeper in the shadow and deeper, therefore, in the layers of the unconscious. The symbol, as we will see later, when it's not just like any other archetype, but is precisely the archetype that is the connective tissue between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious, has a certain kind of porosity, okay? Depending on the type you are, your symbol, your core symbol, and therefore with it, your core fantasy, has a kind of porosity. A porosity of the personal unconscious to the contents of the collective unconscious. And I'm sure that sounds really interesting, so hopefully you want to hear more. Give me a like if you enjoyed this video, guys. Don't forget you can support me on Patreon if you love my content and you never have enough. There's a whole library of like long format, deep dive videos on Patreon, accessible to Patreon supporters. It's only a few euros or dollars a month or a year. And for that, you help me massively, especially in added numbers. You make a big difference to my being able to continue producing content. Could not do this without you, so please consider it. You can also access, as another perk, our Discord server to interact with me and the others there. It's a great community. And don't forget, guys, as well, that you can get my book on the INFJ. It's a few years old now, but I still very much recommend it, The Ecstatic Soul, and you look at the INFJ personality. It's all about the INFJ consciousness, how INFJs think, how the internal world of INFJs is articulated. It's written in slightly less psychoanalytic language than my current language, but it's connected for sure. And its sequel, The Infinite Soul, even more accessibly written, INFJ Life in Modern World, how INFJs can find meaning, purpose, and value in the world today that they often consider hostile. These books go well together. You should definitely get them. See you tomorrow, guys. Take care.